Hello everyone, welcome to MJ Hobby Corner. This is another episode of Gaming Spotlight, and this week we're continuing with last week's Infinite Dark Spotlight. That was the game that I had on the Spotlight. And last week I covered basically just assembling a fleet and went over a couple of things with regard to the rule book. And then this week I'm just going to cover some of the more important rules of the game, and then some of the things in the book, and finish it off today. So for those of you that are new to the channel, welcome. And for those of you that haven't seen my Gaming Spotlight vids, this is just an opportunity for me to take a game out of my gaming library and then just discuss it. It's not an in-depth analysis of the rules or anything else. It's just an overview of the game, the rules, any terrain that could be used for it, or miniatures. Most of the games that I talk about will be miniature agnostic, so they don't have any miniatures line, and are indie games basically. But from time to time I may discuss a bigger kind of mainstream game like Titanicus. So that's basically what these videos are, just a chance to geek out and talk about games. All right, so let's get to Infinite Dark. The rules start around page 27 of the book, and the core system of Infinite Dark is opposed rolls with a D12. All right, that's the main kind of core mechanic of the game. You use opposed players. You do opposed rolls with a D12, and that covers such things as combat. So combat is works with an opposed roll system. Stat tests that may be required of each player. Pilot tests, which is interesting because this game does include pilots, and you can actually have heroes. It's kind of, as I said in the previous video, it's sort of an extra thing. It gives a lot of flavor to the game, but if you're new to the game, the book itself recommends that maybe you don't include pilots until you get used to the rules. I think that's a good idea. But pilots make things very interesting, and they will often have tests in the game, depending on the missions and everything else, and they use 1d12. So many of the stat tests will use a number of d12s, and you kind of have to group your successes. It's kind of like Horizon Wars in that sense, especially the combat system. There is a lucky 12 thing, which in a pilot test, for example, a lucky 12 would be an automatic success. Okay, so there is that. So what is a turn like in Infinite Dark? From what I've read in the book, you get a control deck. First of all, this is very important. This game uses a control deck made up of regular cards, a whole deck of regular cards, including the jokers, in order to activate units. So you get a control deck, and players will activate their units depending on the color of the card that they flip. So one player will be a red card, next player would be a black card, etc. And so when players are flipping from the control deck, if it's a red card, then the red player goes. If it's a black card, the black player goes, activates a ship, and then it goes like that. That's interesting, because that reminds me of Reaper Warlord actually uses that kind of system. So that's interesting. Okay, so that's very important, your control deck, and that has to do with activation. There is also a control hand. In some missions or some events in the game will allow a player to actually take out some cards from the control deck, and it becomes their secret control hand. And there's ways of using also special abilities might trigger that. and it just gives bonuses and things to the player. Just note that you will need a full deck of cards, including the jokers, because the jokers will mean certain things. So activation, every ship gets one action per activation. Okay, many games and many Starship games that I've played, or games with vehicles, whatever it is, units, you get 2 actions, right, that you normally do. In Infinite Dark, every ship gets 1 action. However, that action may trigger bonus actions, which is interesting. May trigger bonus actions that you can then use for your ship. So that's pretty interesting, I thought. And how they're triggered, I'll have to play the game to really get a sense of that. Again, this is a basic overview of the rules as I understood going over them. So you get your 1 action. Now, actions can be many things, and there's a list in the book of different actions. Opening fire, for example, is an action which will lead you into combat. Maneuvering. Maneuvering in this game is similar to some Navy ship games that I've played, where you use a template to maneuver. If you guys, I have a very short video on Uncharted Seas, which is a fantasy naval game. It uses these templates so that the ships can maneuver, and different size ships use different templates. Well, in Infinite Dark, use only 1 template for your ships, but command level of the ship affects how the ship turns. Okay, so that's interesting. And then once all the ships have activated and all the actions have been accomplished, then the game proceeds into the end phase. Now, a couple of things happen in the end phase. Any ships that did not move for whatever reason, sometimes one player finishes first, especially after combat and ships have been lost, etc. So during the end phase, those ships that have not moved in the action phase will move in the end phase. It's pretty cool. So ships that didn't move can now move in the end phase. And as I said, moving ships, especially maneuvering, turning, is going to require a template, and there are 2 things to consider: heading and vector. So that's pretty detailed, actually. That's something that I'll have to look into more. But basically, your command level will give you the heading. Okay, so the heading is the direction in which the ship is pointing. The vector is the direction in which the ship is moving. So the direction the ship is pointed in is not necessarily the direction that the ship is moving. So that's interesting, and I think that's kind of it's a good way to mimic what's going on in space, right? So you're in the end phase, you could have situations where your ship is pointing one way, but it's actually moving a different way. Your heading and your vector could be different. And so in the end phase, you can correct that. Okay, so the rules will tell you exactly how you correct that. One interesting thing is mass, M-A-S, which we talked about in the last video. Mass tells you the arcs of fire that your ship has, whereas command level will give you the maneuvering, right? On the template will tell you how many degrees or whatever the ship can turn. So that's interesting and pretty detailed if you think about it, you know. So that's what happens in the phases. Another thing is when you're maneuvering, you do a stat test, right? And that stat test will then indicate if you get bonus actions or not for your maneuvers. So again, that's explained in the rules. Maybe when we do our first game, we can show that better, right? Best way to learn any game is to play it. So definitely this is something we'll have to learn by the time we do our first battle report. So, okay, so that finishes what I want to say about activations and the turn. Now, the control deck, we already talked about that. It basically, the control deck just tells you who goes, which of the two players goes. So that means that one player can sometimes have several turns where they go. Okay. The other thing is that depending on the missions, the game lasts until the control deck is depleted. Once the control deck is depleted, the game ends. Or if one side is completely wiped out, you know. For solo or co-op games, now I'm not going to go too much into the solo rules. It's a very interesting solo mechanic for the AI. It uses a grid system to pinpoint bogeys. So the enemy is called bogeys, and then you use your cards. The suits, the different color suits, are going to tell you how the enemy behaves. It's an interesting thing. The solo rules, right after it talks about the rules of the game, it goes into solo play and co-op play, and it has its own missions for solo play. So interesting. Okay, so the control hand, as I said, rules and abilities allow you to have a secret control hand, which is drawn from the control deck, and that can help you in various situations. So the turn phases section of the rule book, and the rule book is organized very nicely, by the way. I really like the way the rule book is organized. It goes step by step. The turn phases covers everything from shooting, right, to docking your ships. You can actually dock your ship on a space station. And one thing that actually really interested me that the rulebook stated was that you can play a game of Infinite Dark where you end up docking in a space station, and then your next game is going to be a game of Zero Dark, which is in the Horizon Wars family. And Zero Dark is 28 millimeter skirmish, right? So that's like your pilot or the crew of the ship docks on the spaceship and then has to accomplish its mission on the space station, right? But using two different game systems. That reminds me of something we did way back for Warhammer 40k, where we played Battlefleet Gothic. Whatever affected Battlefleet Gothic, however the game ended, affected our next game of 40k. And Vanguard does that with the missions in Vanguard. Whatever happens in the missions in Vanguard could actually affect a Kings of War game, right? You can link both games like that. So that was really interesting to me. And that's something that I might try in the future, if we can learn both rule sets and then go back and forth, have a campaign that way. That make the game very interesting. Okay, now combat. What I want to say about combat, it's, if you've played Horizon Wars, Infinite Dark's going to seem pretty familiar. Okay, if you've played Horizon Wars, you measure your range. That becomes part of your target number to hit your enemy. In Horizon Wars, you add your armor as well, their armor, the target armor, to that, and that becomes your target number. In Infinite Dark, you only use the measurement to the enemy. So that's interesting. So you do opposed rolls. So you roll a bunch of 12-sided dice depending on your stat. Your stat will tell you how many dice you need. And then once you've measured your range, that's your TN. Your opponent is going to roll a number of defense dice depending on their stat, their defense stat. And all numbers, if your opponent rolls any numbers that are equal to any of the numbers that you rolled, those numbers cancel out. So if I rolled a 12, 3, and a 4, and the opponent rolled a 12, right, with one defense dice, then the 12 is out of the picture. And you only consider the 3 and the 4. And you add those up, and that, that's what determines whether you hit or not. So if that number that you added equals or is equal to or greater than the target number that you've decided on, then that's a hit, right? And sometimes you can have multiple hits, if you have a lot of dice. So that's how it works. It's very similar to Horizon Wars. Some slight differences. Of course, there are modifiers to the damage and everything else, depending on the weapons that are being fired and the ship and everything else. Okay, now what's interesting here, what's different in Infinite Dark, is that you have to consider the mass and power of the target ship. Any hits greater than the mass and power added together causes destruction of the ship. So let's say, so you have a little box called hull damage, and that's where you're going to keep all your hull damage. Once that, all the damage in that box is equal to or greater the mass and power of the ship added together, that ship is destroyed. So that's interesting, because in Horizon Wars, it's a little different, right? So in this game, that is definitely different. So in this game, in Infinite Dark, all hits come off your shields first. And whatever's left over goes into the hull damage box. Okay? And then if the remaining hits, after it came out of the shields, if the remaining hits are greater than the power and mass of the target ship, then the target ship is destroyed. So that's interesting. Okay, so they give you an example in the book with Godhammer. I like that name. And if you look at the little example that they have, you know, 2 shields have been destroyed, then 2 damage have been applied to the hull damage section because the ship took 4 hits. Now, if that ship takes 5 hits, according to its mass and power, then that ship is destroyed. So the example really helps clarify things. You can have collisions in this game, so between ships, so you got to be careful when you're maneuvering and everything. Cosmic terrain, there is a section on terrain. I always love terrain. Always gives me good ideas for building. Okay. Okay, and then the book moves on into the solo rules and into the co-op rules. There are about 6 missions for the player versus player section. So that's not bad. 6 missions, and they have nice little map. And there's a series of things that describe what the mission is about, what you're going to need, etc., and any special rules. So it's pretty detailed in that sense. And then when you go to the solo rules section of the book, you also get a list of missions. So plenty of missions to learn to play the game. It has a very nice section of appendices. I love appendices. It gives you additional information. There's examples of vessels. A nice little section of miniatures, what miniatures you can use, and examples of some handmade stuff as well. So some really cool stuff. So that was worth noting, definitely. And then, of course, there's a section on tokens. You have the maneuvering template, and that's a good thing to look over. And once you understand it a little bit, that's going to help a lot, you know, to play the game. And of course, that's after the tokens. That's pretty much the end of the rule book. There's nothing more to really add. That's all I want to discuss. So, Infinite Dark, definitely a very interesting game. Horizon Wars is a game I really enjoyed. Julie and I have played it. This game is a little more in depth than Horizon Wars because of the maneuvering, and you do a stat test during your maneuvers to see if you get bonus actions and things like that. There are a lot of actions that you can accomplish. But it's a very interesting game, and I love the artwork in the book. I like the way the book is organized. With rules like this, it's nice to have everything step by step. It's not incredibly complex, but there are a few things that, you know, I had to go back and kind of read a couple of times, and definitely playing the game. That's the best way to learn any of these games, right? Playing it, make the mistakes, play it. So we do want to get a game of Horizon Wars Infinite Dark, and I am, as you guys know from my previous videos, I'm making a lot of foam starships, and now that I've been looking at Infinite Dark, well, a lot of those ships that I am making, it's with Infinite Dark in mind. So yeah, I will be posting more on that in the future. So that ends my episode on Infinite Dark. And now the gaming spotlight is going to go on another game. A subscriber actually emailed me a game, some game rules that I'm going to go over for 15mm combat, and it's sci-fi, and I'm going to be doing a spotlight on that. Probably the next spotlight will be on that game. So many thanks to that subscriber. I will mention that again in my next video. All right, folks. Well, thank you very much. I try not to make these too long. Sorry if this one's a little bit long, but there was a lot of material for Infinite Dark, and sometimes I'll do a 2-episode video. Most of the times I try to get it into one. All right, folks, have a good one, and I hope to have some Infinite Dark, Horizon Wars Infinite Dark in the future. Have a great one. We'll talk very soon.